Good morning. Good morning. My gosh, what time of day is it? Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first event of the series for the 2005 Sotterley Presents People and Perspectives. My name is Nancy Easterling. It is an honor to serve as the Executive Director of Historic Sotterley, and it's an honor to be on the panel with everybody here tonight for this wonderful event that's going to kick us off. And it seems so appropriate in February to have this the first event, because as Gwen Bankins, who is on our panel tonight, had said, this is sort of a restorative year for us in many ways. We're looking at many things that are creating that feeling, which will culminate when you all come for the Day of Unity and Healing in August. So tonight's event, deeply rooted a shared history through restorative genealogy, will feature the panelists that you see tonight. But let me, before I do introductions, let me give you just a few pointers. I would love for you all to sign into the chat. Let us know where you're joining us from tonight. And throughout the evening, feel free to talk in the chat, but we also invite your questions. If you can, put the questions in the Q&A rather than in the chat. That way we won't miss them. Catherine Humphreys will be monitoring both, but we will appreciate your questions. And when the panelists have done with their portion, we will come back and we will bring your questions in. So we look forward to that. You know, I was thinking today, this is 2025, and we started up with speaker events in 2006. We had Lonnie Bunch was one of our first panelists that year, who was the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And here, all these years later, almost 20 years later, we are going strong, and we are glad that you are here to start off the 20th year for this series. So let me take a moment and introduce our panelists, but I think Chrissy was going to put up a photo for us so everybody could see it. Many of you know these wonderful people that really are the two founders, I would say, of our Descendants project. You see back in 1996, this photo of Agnes King Callum and John Hanson Briscoe, who served on the board at a time where this site was deemed one of the 11 most endangered historic sites in America. And these incredible friends and colleagues helped to not only save this site, but their interactions, their respect for each other, their dedication to making these stories continue to be told are what has inspired how we interpret the site and how we work at Sotterley, and has really been the reason that our Descendants project has taken off the way that it has. So we thought it was appropriate for a woman who was an incredible genealogist, who shared her information with her friend John Hanson, who accepted the information and said, you're right, we need to make sure all of this is told. And this is a basis by which we are talking tonight. So let me give you the introductions. I think many of you who are our friends and family already know some of our panelists, but in case you don't know all of them, let me go through. First, we will have Gwen Bankins, who is a St. Mary's County native. She's the vice president of our board of trustees, the chair of our preservation, restoration, and interpretation committee, our Day of Unity and Healing chair, and a direct descendant of the Kane family. She is related to Agnes King Callum. She's on the steering committee for the Southern Maryland National Heritage Area, Dismantling Racism and Privilege in Southern Maryland, and is part of the Southern Maryland Equity and History Coalition, is a St. Mary's County Sheriff's Office Master Chaplain, and she is retired from SMECO's Engineering and Operations Department. Her resume is way too long to list everything, so I just did a little bit. But of course, her most important thing is she is our descendant and part of our family. And I'm just looking up on my screen. So now I'm flipping to my other side, and we have Mr. Sam Baldwin, founder and senior partner of the law offices of Baldwin, Briscoe, Steinmetz, and Ori. He's practiced family law for over 20 years in Southern Maryland. Raised in Baltimore, he attended St. Paul's School for Boys, the University of Virginia, and earned his JD from the University of Baltimore in 1984. Throughout his career, Mr. Baldwin has gained extensive legal experience through various clerkships, internships, and positions in prominent law offices before establishing his own practice in 1988. And if you have not ever heard of it before, go to their website, and on this you will be able to find the link for the book that Sam created, which is the John Hanson Briscoe Project. In this book, there is so much not only about John Hanson, but the state of Maryland and Agnes King Callum and Sotterley. It's an incredible treasure, so go look it up. Mr. Jerome Spears is a native of Baltimore, Maryland. He earned his geography degrees from Morgan State University and the University of Hawaii. Go Rainbows. He is my friend. We both graduated from University of Hawaii. Go figure. He has used his formal training and other life experience to champion the cause of uncovering and preserving his family's narrative and history. He is historic Sotterley and Susquehanna plantation descendant, as well as Georgetown GU 272, who in 2016 authored a manuscript entitled I've Got Your Back, where he chronicled his 8 linear ancestral families in Southern Maryland, rising from slavery to freedom and beyond. He was a featured panelist in the inaugural Stakeholders Descendant of Slavery Empowerment Conference at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, along with Gwen Bankins. And what a thrill it was to have the two of you up there representing your stories, Sotterley stories. What a great achievement. That was just incredible. So right in the middle of my screen is Reverend Dante Eubanks, a native of Cincinnati and a 1992 Coleraine High School graduate. Now he lives in Centertown, Maryland with his family. A United States Navy veteran, Reverend Eubanks was licensed to preach at 20 and ministered in various locations, eventually founding the New Covenant Christian Worship Center in 2014. A history enthusiast and genealogist, he is active in numerous historical societies. Married to our wonderful Carrie, he has 10 children. I just have to say that because I am in awe that he has any hair left. It's really impressive. He is amazing, and they're beautiful. He has a beautiful family, and notably, he did not even know he was from Maryland until he moved back here, but you'll hear more about that when he talks. So Mr. Kelsey Bush is a native of Lexington Park, Maryland, and is a community affairs liaison for St. Mary's College of Maryland, and has a diverse background in public service and community involvement. He earned a Bachelor of Arts from St. Mary's College of Maryland and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law. Before his current role, he served as the Interim Chief Diversity Officer at St. Mary's College and worked for St. Mary's County Government for 20 years, developing youth initiatives and addressing various community issues. And with me tonight, you will see Catherine Humphreys. Catherine Humphreys is our interpretive programs manager. She has been with Sotterley for 10 years and is a key and integral part to everything that we do here interpretively at Sotterley. So you are here tonight not to listen to me, but to hear the stories of these panelists. So to get started, Ms. Gwen Bankins, the Vice President of our board and our Chair Day of Unity and Healing, why don't you get started, please, Ms. Gwen, and tell us a little bit about your journey and story.
Well, first, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. And it's amazing when you think of the journey. My journey started, sad to say, almost 50 years ago. And for me, I was sitting here and adding up the numbers to try to figure out how long it had been. And I was in 7th grade when I first stepped on site, as I've shared many times in many presentations. And one of the things that sticks out most to me from a conversation I had earlier today is that it took a history teacher in college when I was in Salisbury to really get me to embrace the history, because the history was a history that was hidden. Even though I was there when Agnes was uncovering it, and I was a part of it when we had our first family day on site, I couldn't embrace it because I didn't understand it. So when you look at history through a healing lens, if you want to look at it that way, I think of going to college, gaining a perspective, learning that the ancestors that look like me help contribute to build this country. Kelsey, Dante, and myself were working together in the community. Jan, who's not on the call but is a descendant, also was working in the community, known all of them 10 plus years, and not knowing that our history was connected. So when you talk about the journey to restorative justice, to restorative genealogy, it restores family ties. And I thought Jerome, my cousin on my dad's side, was Jerome that was a mile and a half down the road from me until I met him at an event at Sotterley. And each cousin, each family member, each shared connection brings a piece of your history back. I never thought about trauma associated with history before. Again, it's a different lens that you could look at because of the colonization, because of the separation of family, because of how it hurts to know that your ancestors were once looked upon as property. I was looking at a chair one day at a Sotterley event, and Jan was like, "It's your turn," kind of like, "Tag, you're it. You need to tell the Sotterley story." And right in the middle of telling the story, I was looking at the chair, and it hit me that my ancestors were considered property. And that really hurts to think that they weren't even considered human. So how do you process all of this? I processed it bite by bite, bite by bite. And Maryland Public TV was doing a taping with us for Maryland Farm and Harvest. And I'd passed through the slave cabin for 40 years. But I had to, what was supposed to be a 10-minute journey through the slave cabin was a 4-hour sit and not move in the slave cabin on one of the hottest days in 2018. And it really made me see my ancestors' journey, to look at the mattress, to look at the fact that if I look up the hill, 13 people lived in the manor house. And I'm looking at a 16 by 18 structure where 13 to 14 of my relatives possibly lived in that potential cabin. It does something to you because it makes you look at life differently. It makes you it humbles you, it makes you very grateful, but most of all, it makes you want to find out more. How did they survive? Why did they survive? I always say I'm here because my ancestors survived. Slavery was an institution. My ancestors were intelligent, they were resilient, and they were gifted and talented in the way in which they built structures around historic Sotterley and other places in this country. So for a shared journey, it's putting the pieces together of your family's life that was once scattered and finding family members that you never knew that you could be looking at, working with, not even knowing that there's a shared and common connection. So I'm humbled, I'm thankful, and I'm grateful to learn from the individuals that you have on this site. And and that's just it for right now. I'm just thankful, for the legacy. Thankful that Agnes wanted to find out who the individuals were that lived in the 16 by 18 cabin, finding out who our ancestors were, what they did. It really took a fifth grade STEM student to make me realize my family was important as well.
It was beautiful, Gwen. And as she said she was voluntold to come here.
Yeah, yeah.
So you've gone from being voluntold to making sure that others are showing up, and maybe you're doing the voluntelling now.
Yes, I am. Right, Kelsey? Right, Dante?
Now you saw Kelsey's laughing over there. Oh, yeah. They understood it was an important journey, and now you understand the same thing. I love it.
That's right, Trey.
Well, for everybody who's watching tonight, just in case if you want to see the person who's talking on a bigger screen, I don't think we can make that person get bigger, but if they aren't bigger on your screen and you want them to be bigger, just go up in the view and put them on speaker view, and then you'll be able to see that bigger. So I'm just throwing that out for anybody. So next we are going to go to Mr. Jerome, who Gwen loves to call our DNA guru. And I just have to point out again, if you missed some of Jerome's talks with us in the past, he did, and you want to understand a little bit more in depth, more time than we have here tonight. He did an incredible presentation for us at one of our Common Ground events and really demystified DNA. And I just have to throw that out, Jerome, because I know you don't have time tonight to go into that in depth, but I just want to throw that out. It's on our YouTube channel and it's amazing. But Jerome, tell us a little bit about you and your journey.
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here tonight. This is certainly a special evening. I believe some of the planning involved trying to do this commensurate with what would have been the 100th birthday anniversary of Agnes King Callum. So how fitting that we're, I guess, just a couple of days off from that anniversary date as we talk about her and Judge Briscoe and all the things that took place over many years. For me, my journey started like a lot of people who are of my age. I go back to Alex Haley and Roots. And when that miniseries aired in the late 1970s, it's one thing to learn or study the history, but to be provided a visual, to see with your own eyes, to hear with your own ears some of the things that happened during that period of world history was just unbelievable. And my family kind of parlayed that introduction of Roots into our own narrative. We were up in Baltimore, and we were fortunate enough to have our maternal grandparents who were from Southern Maryland. And my aunt and my cousin helped to gather us all together and convene us in a forum where we could hear our grandparents speak of their own narrative. And I would dare say many of us can remember segments of what they told us to this very day. For those that weren't there or hadn't been born yet, my aunt and cousin will also had the presence of mind to tape record the proceedings. And so even to this day now, we can hear in their own voice their narratives as they described it to us back in 1979. And I can still hear the voices. Our grandparents talked about St. Mary's County in general, and Sotterley in particular did come up a couple of times. But it was years later when I started my own genetic research journey that it became useful to recall some of that data, and countless and priceless nuggets of information came pouring back in, which continues to help me even in my present day work. In Southern Maryland, we are all genetically related so many different ways. It's almost unbelievable. This backdrop that's being shown highlights just a few of the many connections that I individually have, specifically relating to Sotterley, but also pertaining to Southern Maryland as well. So there's lots of history here. And my goal is and always has been to learn the history, to discover what I can, to run my leg of the race as effectively as I can, and then pass on what I've learned to the future generations that come behind. And so that's what I will continue to do. And I welcome any questions that might come up at the back end of this, but I'll stop here and let someone else go at this point. Thank you.
And Jerome, you have actually not only found out about connections in Africa, but you have actually contacted, correct?
I've made connections in Africa. I've made connections in Europe. I've made connections in Australia. I mean, our DNA spans the globe. And I would suspect Dante, as part of his talk, will maybe get into how migration patterns and timelines come into play. But yeah, once you start blending in some of the genetic data with some of the other great research that other experts have done, it's a powerful combination to help tell our story.
Absolutely. So now our next person in line that we're talking to actually is Dante. So Dante, I would love it if you could share a little bit about your journey and your story with us.
Good evening to everyone. And again, thank you all so much for joining us on this night. Um, Definitely a journey. That in itself, it is a journey. It's not one to be taken lightly. It comes with many highs. It comes with some lows, but it is definitely a journey. And I would say one worth taking. Born and raised in Cincinnati. I got to Southern Maryland because I was in the Navy. And I chose Maryland, honestly, because it was close to Ohio. That was why I chose it. The very second I got here in '96, numerous people kept saying, "Oh, yeah, I spoke to your grandmother, or I saw your aunt, or saw your uncle. We're so proud of you. Glad to have you home." And I didn't know who these people were talking about. But everybody was confident in their talking to me. Was here 3.5 years. My now 25-year-old son was a baby at the time when there was a funeral, and my sister came down, and we were talking past each other for 3 days about her travels and where she was going and where I was. I never told anyone that I was stationed at Patuxent River. I just said the air base in Maryland, and everyone assumed Andrews. We did know that we had Maryland connections, but no one ever talked about places. No one ever talked about names or anything like that. But when I started realizing more and more, and got introduced to people at a repast of a funeral, I'll never forget my cousin Sheila Milburn. To this day, we laugh because she used to always say, "You know, you related to us." I said, "No, I'm not related to anybody in Southern Maryland." And she said, "Okay, well, you're gonna call me back one day, and you're gonna tell me that we're related." And I had to call back, left a message, and she just busted out laughing. She said, "I told you so." Uh, just as Gwen stated, being active in the community, working with so many different people, fellowshipping with so many different people because of church. And then you start learning, because the elders were passing, and you began to piece together those oral histories, or, as many of us started doing the ancestry DNA testing, and we was like, surprise, oh, we're cousins. And it's not as far as we think. That's the blessing. And I would probably venture to say, as Jerome mentioned, the migration patterns, I'm a lover of history. I would probably say I would channel Sam in that regard, is I love all things history. So I pair the knowledge of history and events with what our family history is to better understand the big migration story. And Maryland is connected to so many areas of this country, whether it's through Catholic education, the expansion of Catholicism, or just simple migrations of families expanding into what was then in the 1700s, the Western frontier, and also going to deeper places of the South. But it all comes back to it is a journey. It is a journey, and grateful again for the journey, and grateful to share that journey with my cousins Jerome, Kelsey, and Gwen, and so many that are in the chat. It's just a blessing that we we can collaborate, we can share knowledge with one another, but also tap into each other's respective areas, if you will, and what our expertise is. And all of us will agree. We leave the DNA sleuthing up to cousin Jerome because he is excellent, but grateful for the journey.
That's amazing. Amazing. Thank you, Dante. You know, there are so many connections that you all have made, and we have a descendant family hour once a quarter for many of you have been able to join us that are our descendants. There's some people in the chat that I'm saying are descendants. And what's funny is the amount of time people like, I don't know you. Where do you live? Wait a minute. Who's your family? I think we're related. And I tell you, it makes the world a lot smaller, doesn't it? It really does. Our next person that I'm going to have to do is not a Sotterley descendant, but he is married to a Sotterley descendant. So next up, let's have Mr. Sam Baldwin.
Good evening, everyone. And Chrissy, can I have that photo up there? Nancy introduced this talk as restorative genealogy. And I want to tell the backstory of this photo because it is kind of restorative. Agnes Callum and John Briscoe were being interviewed by CBS Sunday Morning. And the storyline was his great-grandfather owned her great-grandfather at Sotterley, and they were working together to save the slave cabin. And what an interesting story that was. So the thing that I think is relevant to tonight is Charles Smith asked each of them what their great-grandfathers would think of them sitting together side by side, both of them on the board at Sotterley, and as trustees, both of them somewhat owning Sotterley. And they were reflecting on how far this culture, this society has come from the time of their great-grandparents to the two of them sitting there side by side. And that is part of the restorative process. But the word restorative is a continuum. So we can put this photo down, Chrissy. I'm going to sort of tap into Jerome, the DNA guru. Definitely rely on Dante and the difficult discussion that history sometimes have, and start with this. I was a student at the University of Virginia in the 70s when there was a lot of talk about Thomas Jefferson having children with Sally Hemings. And that got national exposure. And because we knew who Jefferson was, it sort of gave an introduction to the country to this context that I think what Nancy just said, we're all related. And it does make the community smaller when you know you are related. It's not just the white Briscoes that I'm married into, and then all these other Briscoes that have that name and they live down here. But see, I moved down from Baltimore. I didn't know the history of Sotterley. I didn't know the history of the county. I learned, for sure I learned because of John Hanson and Agnes. But as a lawyer, I would meet people in the community, and I would have clients say, clients that did not look like John Briscoe say with a smirk on their face, I'm related to your father-in-law. And I had no way of knowing how to process that or relate that or discuss it with anyone in the family. As a young lawyer, I didn't. But the more I studied Agnes and her research into the family, and then the more I started interviewing people in the community for this book that Nancy talked about, the John Hanson Briscoe book. And then a black Briscoe hands me a photograph, and in the blink of an eye, quicker than the blink of an eye, I knew and told my wife, Jan, I said, Jan, you are related. And and Jan, I can still see her shaking her head no. And then looking over at Stacy Briscoe, shaking her head yes. So I asked Judge Briscoe, and we had never ever talked about this, but I was interviewing him, and it was so sensitive that I said, I'm turning this tape recorder off because I have a question. I want to ask you about something that happened in the office. And I said, I saw this photograph, and this lady says she's related to you. Did this happen? And of course, being a very polished jurist, lawyer, and politician, his answer said it all. He said those things happened back then. That was confirmation to me. And of course it was not foreign because of the Thomas Jefferson thing, but no one talked about it. I think in prepping for tonight's talk, it was somewhat easier for me to acknowledge it because I'm not from Southern Maryland and I wasn't brought up in this culture. But I still, coming back to what Dante said, this was not an easy conversation. And it certainly wasn't my conversation because I'm not a Briscoe. So I had to be very mindful of the fact that maybe not everyone wants to talk about this. And yet, the more we did talk about it and the more we did realize, yes, this is a tight community and we are all related in ways that maybe you don't talk about, but we're related. And how do you express it? It brings us all closer. When I can look at Jerome and Dante and Kelsey and Gwen and say, look, I'm not a Briscoe, but I know you're part of the family. And it just creates another feeling of familiarity in the family sense. So that was, let's have that last photo, Chrissy. So I was, the County Times knew I was writing these chapters of the book, and that's my son on the left, and that is a friend of his who, I knew, DeVar Briscoe. And when I mentioned to one of the writers at the County Times, I said, well, this is what I'm working on right now, and it's a sensitive topic, etc. But being a pushy editor, he said, we want to do a photo shoot. And fortunately, my son Sammy was working for me. DeVar, I knew how to get a hold of DeVar right away. And they just assumed that we wanted to go down to the slave cabin and take that photograph at the slave cabin. And I said, no. When we went down there, and I said, no, that is not the photo you're taking. You're taking the photo of both of them with that mansion in the background. Because if there is a blood relationship, it is not just at that slave cabin. It's also up at that mansion. Because as Jerome knows, genealogy is an accident of genetics. My wife Jan, she's connected to Sotterley, not personally, but through genetics. And somebody like Gwen and DeVar in this photograph here, you're all related, not just to that slave cabin, but to that mansion also. If you can trace your DNA there, that's part of you also. You didn't just build it, you're descended from the owners of that. So that was a tough story to tell, and I frankly sat on that story for about a year as I'm working my way through both sides of the Briscoe family. Is it okay if I write this? Is it okay if I say this? But I did, and there you have it. And then of course this full page cover, Sotterley History May Reveal New Family Ties. Frankly, one of the Briscoes I interviewed, he was in my office and he pointed to one of the Briscoe photographs in my room and he said, we're related to that guy and we've known it for generations. We've known it, but there was sort of an agreement to just not talk about it. And there you go, Nancy.
Thank you, Sam. I appreciate that. Before we come to Kelsey, I do want to just remind everybody, please, if you have some questions, go ahead. You don't need to wait. go ahead and get them queued up and put them in the Q&A. I know there have been a few little questions that people have just had little answers for already in the chat. But sign into the chat if you haven't, and make sure you put your questions in there. And Kelsey, of course, when I was introducing you, I forgot, for us, one of the most important things is not only are you a Sotterley descendant, but you're the secretary of our board of trustees. And I left that off. So now I'm going to say that. And I'd love to have you take the floor and talk about your journey.
I'm the novice of this group because I'm the one who's just starting my journey, in essence, in the timeline. My journey started about 3 years after my mom passed away, because of the fact that she was the holder of all the keys and knowing all the different connections. Like, she looked at Dante and called him out and said, hey, we're related. And lo and behold, she was right. Because she said, you look like these people, and who needs genealogy when you look like certain individuals that are inside the county? So we all know how that can be. But when she passed away, a lot of that knowledge disappeared because of the fact that of the pains that her generation had about discussing. She understood and would say that we were from the county, but she would not give complete context of whereabout in the county we were from. And slowly she revealed those things, but it wasn't until I spit in a cup and sent off DNA material, because I'd been walking next to Sotterley as a friend of Sotterley for a few years. And as Gwen said, we had worked in programs together for over a decade. But her mom kind of had an inkling of the family tie. But I'll never forget having that information revealed to me, that not only this place that I found sort of a home with was an actual home, was a place where my family's roots prospered. So, and in essence, it is that tie between, what you know and what you don't know, and how it reveals itself in a slow pace and allows you to grow continuously. So I'm going to leave it at that because of the simple fact that we got a lot to discuss this evening.
And yes, we do. So the next person who I'm going to introduce, and she's going to bring up some of the questions that I think that have already come up, is Catherine Humphreys. Now, Catherine has another thing you don't realize about her. Just not that long ago, 6 months ago, Catherine has figured out not only does she have extremely deep roots to this county, which we always knew that she's one of the Ark and Doves, but she's a Sotterley descendant. So Catherine, I'm going to let you go next.
So Sotterley has always been in my worldview, I would say, as somebody who is born and raised St. Mary's Countyan. And this was a field trip site. This was our go-to for education. But for me, it was almost an innate connection to and a sense of more than just a superficial connection. And I look at the people who are speaking tonight, and some of them are people that have kind of been intersecting in my world my entire life. Gwen with volunteer programming, and my father being involved in volunteer programming in the county. I've known Gwen since I was a child. She knows where the skeletons are buried, but she's not going to tell on me yet. But Gwen also went to school with members of my mom's family. Jan and my mother went to school together. Kelsey and I are connected through connections with St. Mary's College. And so it's interesting to be a descendant and know that right away I felt a deeper connection. at Sotterley as the interpretive programs manager. This place is never going to be and never has been just a job for me. My father in the 70s did archaeological work here, and my mother's family, and this is the fun thing, is connected to the families that James Bowles and his daughters married into, the Platers and the Briscoes. And I was speaking with another Sotterley descendant a couple of weeks ago, and it was Donald Barber's brother. And he said, did it ever occur to you that you were meant to be here, that you had a place here, that the connection was deeper than the trees here? And I went, it's always been something for me. This place has a pull for me that I cannot explain in words. And so it was interesting to just decide on a whim to do Ancestry and 23andMe, and I start stumbling along names, and I'm going, I know that name. I talk about that name on a daily basis during the tour season. I know these people. And to find that I'm connected to this place in such a deep way. And so that's my descendant story. And we actually do have some really good questions in the chat, Nancy. This is for everybody. That's all the panelists tonight. How do you think that individuals and historical organizations can get young people ages 12 to 21 interested in learning their ancestral history and or local history? Not everybody grew up with a parent that was a historian and archaeologist like I did, and we just were exposed to it. How do we do that? What approach should we take, or how should we change our approach? So, I think, Miss Gwen, we're going to go with you for that one first.
Yeah, I say that because of stepping on site as a kid and not wanting to be invested. It is one of those things that I think now we have technology. The DNA test is the one thing that's really going to bring in the connections to other individuals, family photos. Let them start their own story, and also make it almost like a treasure hunt. Once that ancestry bug bites them, you'll be looking at another Jerome and another Dante. They can't get enough, and because the connections, they just keep continuing. And then what were they doing during that time? If we can have second graders, fifth graders, seventh graders, and eighth graders on site, college students on site, adults on site, seniors on site, it starts with their story.
Anybody else would like to chime in on that one? Because getting young people invested, it's an age-old story.
I would just add that the formula certainly worked well for me. Even if they're young, get them in the room with the elders and somebody turn on our tape recorder or a video recording. And even if it doesn't stick right away, in 10 or 12 or 15 years, they might want to circle back to hear what grandmom had to say or grandpop had to say or uncle had to say at some point in the future. And they'll greatly appreciate that someone took the time to sit them down when they were real small and make sure they were part of the room as this narrative was being laid out, relating to people who they would eventually know better. And so create those small pockets of data that will survive a few generations and help to drop those breadcrumbs for future people to be able to come behind and pick up, so that if they're not ready now, something would be there for them when they are ready.
Yep, I agree. Having as many children as my wife and I do, one of the things I know, my kids probably, they hear it from me all the time, but it's always a joy when they come to me with that aha moment, because they remembered something that I may have shared, or their grandparents or other elders in the family. In my office at home, I have my elders' pictures on the top of my bookcases, so they kind of look over my shoulder as I'm working at my desk. And that's always meant something to me. And through the years, one by one, my kids have all asked questions about who's in that picture, or man, Gambuda looks like that person, and they call my mom Gambuda. And my great grandfather, I look just like him. So they ask those questions. And recently, we were blessed to be able to see pictures from my wife's family, and just be able to sit in awe and go, oh my gosh, that's where those genes come from. Oh my goodness. So we're sharing those things. And even just within the local area, I talk about so many of the different areas and families and how they were all connected in the various churches. And occasionally when we're driving, my son will go, Dad, isn't that the place that you were talking about? And so if we think they're not listening, they are. I think from an education perspective, and whether education by school or education within our own families from the home, we've got to keep the conversation going. I think Jerome said it best: get those young folks in the same spaces with the elders as often as possible, so that they can pick up on those pearls of wisdom. It will pay off dividends later.
And I thought maybe Kelsey, since you have not, Kelsey has brought his kids to the Day of Unity, to some of the events, and you're down at the college. So between your own kids, which I don't know, did they get voluntold or did they come?
They got voluntold. So,
Yes,
but
pass it on.
but in the same vein, one of the most important things is telling history unvarnished, being straightforward and unblemished with what you're speaking about. Because too often we try to curtail the conversation and prevent harm to students where they're open. They want to hear the complete unvarnished history. They want to hear the unedited version, age appropriate, but they want to have that understanding and the compassion that goes along with it. Because the biggest question you get is, how can people have done this to someone else? Why would someone do this to someone else? And you get into larger discussions about economics, about the whole dispelling some of the things that we unintentionally teach when it comes to this narrative, where you have the majority of individuals being unskilled laborers, just being in the field, where we know that's not true. That multiple individuals were skilled craftsmen who were selected for whatever region they were in Africa to be brought over because of that different skill set. And it allows for people to rewrite some of the narrative that's being put out there, and understand that generations of individuals have brought gifts and had gifts, and allowed for the blossoming of generations beyond them. So it's one of those things where having that conversation and having the understanding that you are fulfilling the dream of the generations before you, and you are bringing together in a way of the completion of someone's ideal, be it in the mansion or in the slave quarter. You are the fulfillment of that person's dream, and having that understanding and being able to have that conversation. So I'll leave it there.
And I want to follow up on, I said, introduce them to a DNA test, but make sure when you introduce them, make sure you're ready for what you're going to get back. So just explore, because I found out, one of the things we don't talk about is our Native American ancestry enough. And when we're multiracial and we really don't know that because maybe it came ahead of us and we didn't know it. So make sure you prepare them, because you may find out some things by testing your children that didn't show up on your DNA test. So just make sure, it's history is Forrest Gump, like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.
I want to chime in on this because, especially with Gwen and Jan, as I know with Sam and Kelsey, part of what we've been able to do is have conversations and dialogue with diverse grade levels of students in the past couple of years. And that includes Jan and Gwen and Kelsey sitting down with teachers and with school groups, coming to the site and sharing their journeys. And I think that that's a form of restorative genealogy in and of itself, because we all know that fifth graders and eighth graders, there's not much of a filter between what they're thinking and what they're going to say, but they ask you these heartfelt questions that are deeply thought out. And I can't count the number of times I've been bumped into in Target or at the grocery store or out in public since these field trips. And I've had people tell me my kid is still talking about that. So there's a willingness for especially preteens and teenagers to have conversations, and they're receptive to it. They, going off what Kelsey was saying, tell the truth in these conversations, but don't be afraid to share history through a deeply personal, direct connection. And Descendants have been able to do that here, and the conversation continues at home because of what they've experienced here.
Nice. Thank you, Catherine. I think there we several more questions in the chat. We'll see how many of them we can get through. Again, Catherine, you want to go on to the next one?
So the next one is, what resources do you know of which provide guidance for historical organizations or individuals that want to respectfully and tastefully capture African American contributions related to their historical sites or families? I do think one group that we should acknowledge is our local UCAC, which really highlights the contributions of African Americans in our community here in Southern Maryland. We also have the Southern Maryland Equity and History Coalition, which many of us are members of, and some of you are on the steering committee for it, which their websites for both UCAC and the Southern Maryland Equity and History Coalition are phenomenal resources. And if you're looking to figure out how to have the conversations, these two groups, along with the Big Conversation, which is kind of the parent group for the History Coalition, are great resources for organizations, especially here in Southern Maryland.
And I'm going to back up one more time. When we talk about getting kids involved, the arts, through documentary story quilting, through oral history, through first or third person interpretation, drawing, sketching, painting. We have a phenomenal artist doing the Descendants Portrait Project to add humanity to our Descendants project. She was touched at a UNESCO Day of Remembrance for those who perished or survived the transatlantic slave trade. So getting them involved in multiple ways, I think will keep them hooked. And it's not just opening a book. I think with today's kids, it has to be fast, it has to be interactive, and the more technology involved, I think the better.
I also think, when we talk about resources and what guidance is out there, I think we miss the very first step along the journey. Is it starts with yourself. Document everything. Everybody has a story. Some of those nuggets that we've learned through the years about grandmama's cooking, or granddaddy's job on the railroad, or Cousin Jerome talks about the uncle that was a porter on the out in Chicago. You know, those are stories that also talk about migration, talk about expanding beyond borders, talks about occupation. You know, often times we're looking for someone to tell us the how to, but it's really, what do you want to share about your family? What do you want to share about their work ethics? What do you want to share about their land ownership? What do you want to share about how they were part of the start of a church or the start of a school, or business owners? There's so many things that can be shared. There are many historical organizations at the local and state levels. There's the St. Mary's Genealogical Society, the St. Mary's Historical Society. Many of us are part of the Descendants of Jesuit Enslavement Historical and Genealogical Society. There's also University of Virginia. UVA has a wonderful organization that are looking for descendants of the laborers that built the institution. So seek out those organizations that are doing active work in along this, what we're calling a restorative journey, of telling those stories across a multitude of generations, across borders, because there are touch points along the way that you're not going to find in a census. You're not going to find in a will. You're not going to find in a land deed. There are more stories out there, nuggets of information that you never know. One piece of your story may be the beginning journey for someone else, but they will never find it if it's never published or shared, whether it's through a family newsletter, start a blog. If you know, do a recording. Jerome mentioned that several times. You know, get it down and share it. Don't hold on to it. Oftentimes, I think the one that we do disservice to ourselves and our respective families is we don't share the stories. So then when those elders pass, we're all trying to grasp the straws, or find those breadcrumbs to piece together. So let's take the action now. We're all budding storytellers, right? We all have something to offer and bring to the conversation. So it starts with yourself. You are the greatest resource in sharing your story and your family's history.
I think that's a beautiful, Dante. And to Dante's point, if you are from Southern Maryland or you have roots here in Southern Maryland, the Southern Maryland Equity and History Coalition that Catherine mentioned, they are looking for more wonderful stories to be able to have on this website and enrich this resource, which teachers are looking at now and other people who are exploring their own journeys. Sharing is caring. So if you have information about your family, your family's history, other organizations, this is a resource for you to share. I will say, as a historical, and one of the questions that came up was about historical organizations. Just make sure when you're looking at sharing stories that you're getting the buy-in from the people whose stories you're sharing. Don't just go for guidance you found online that looks good, because these aren't your stories. They're somebody else's. And make sure you're getting a cultural assessment if you're developing something in the process, and certainly before you go live. Make sure you're asking and you're saying, with the cultural sensitivity, am I telling the story the way that somebody would want it told? Because we have become very sensitive to that here, because it's not my story. And Sam alluded to, you know, how do you work when it is, he said he was not encumbered by historical baggage, but also if it's not your story, at what point do you say it's not mine to share? Let me make sure somebody else says it's okay. So I will say that for historical institutions, just be sensitive to that. Catherine, I know we have other questions in here, so I'll let you get back to those.
And I want to tap into one thing, which is the way historical organizations interpret the history. We're evolving. It's going to be an evolutionary journey, but and to be mindful of that. I can say that in my particular role, I have that core group of descendants who a lot of them are here in presenting, and I go to them with, what are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on interpreting that? And the other big thing for any historical organization, in my personal opinion, is make history personal, because it's not just about a war or a moment in time. History is about people. And by making it about people, you humanize it, you remind people that it's about the individuals that who lived and labored at Sotterley over the centuries, versus about, it's a 300 some year old house on a hill. It's about people. And when you do that, you will also see that young adults and children, students of all ages, are much more receptive to the history, because you're not siloing it, you're not containing it into a specific moment in time. And history doesn't happen in a bubble, there's a legacy. So by descendants sharing their story, you show a journey that we continue to be on. It's not a start and stop. I'm going to kind of continue with the next question, which kind of picks up with something Dante said and kind of hints at the work of Jerome. How much of the journey is oral tradition? How much of it is through DNA testing, and how much is historical research? So this is actually like a Dante, Jerome, and Sam question. So what do each of these components contribute, and how much of the journey does each one consist of?
Well, I'll start. I've been a little quiet for a while, but I think it's exactly what Dante was saying. You know, these little bits, you're not going to get the whole story from any one source. And so you get it from oral history. And you know, some historians may say, well, you know, that's oral history. We don't know if it's true. But you take that oral history and you compare it to what you know happened, like for the Briscoes at Sotterley. We didn't have a complete history, but we could look at Monticello and Thomas Jefferson and say, what was happening there? What's so unique about Sotterley that it wasn't happening here? So it's oral history, it's DNA, it's looking at other places and putting everything together as a composite to say we don't necessarily have 100% of the facts of what was happening way back when, but this is the most logical. Dante, your
Yeah.
take?
I agree. I think, you know, when I started this journey, I started, you know, obviously with the immediate family. And I noticed that my great grandparents were all born either in Mississippi, Alabama, or Georgia. But then I began to notice that either their parents or their grandparents were all born in the Carolinas, Virginia, or Maryland and Kentucky. And it was like, well, how did that happen? And so that's when I started studying more so of the history and the, you know, little tidbits about you know, the states. You know, for instance, how many people knew that Georgia in the 1700s, post the Revolutionary War, Georgia was considered the Western frontier. Georgia was the debtor's prison for those people that you know, rose up against the colonies and even after the Revolution wanted to remain loyal to the British Empire. They were sent to the debtor's prison at that time. That was Georgia. So it's those things like that that you're not going to find that squarely by looking at census records or wills. It's learning the history of those areas. You know, Jerome and I, we collaborated or messaged back and forth on Ancestry for over 4 years. And he was Poet Skylark. I was Reverend DME. it wasn't until after we had been together in different forums numerous times, and he said, "Are you on Ancestry?" I said, yeah. I said, "My username is this." He said, what? And lo and behold, when he told me his username, I said, "Oh, you got to be kidding." So, reaching across the aisle and sharing that unique connection, you learn more of the story. There are things that Jerome shared I would have never known had we not broke down the wall of a username, and we began a more intimate conversation and shared some of those family secrets. So it's the oral history, it's learned history, it's deciphering the records and looking at the old English and the pretty handwriting that most people can't read today, and late nights, but it's dedication on this journey. And then, of course, again, we're in this new age of DNA, and Jerome finds stuff, and it's like, did you see this? And it makes you go down rabbit holes, but those rabbit holes are nuggets to a whole new world. I'll channel the Little Mermaid spirit there. It's pivotal to the journey, and you learn so much more. And I'll leave this and pass it over to Jerome. During the pandemic, a friend, a sister in arms, a relative started a call to talk about Jesuit enslavement. Karen Harper Royal, a phenomenal person. And one of the things that Catherine said is we got to be careful and how we tell the story, share the story. Nancy shared about be careful that when you're sharing the stories, you get that rapport and that respect from that particular family and honor them in the right way. And one thing that Karen did from the very beginning is she left a seat at the table. She gave an invitation to bring people in. So that's one of the things in this journey. And when we talk about the oral history, learned history, and the DNA, we've got to be inviting, and then we've got to help those along the way, because if we're helping them, 9 out of 10 times that's going to be reciprocated, and you kind of build a network. And if everybody's researching from different areas, if you've got a DNA detective like Jerome, you've got a meticulous researcher and documentarian such as Sam, and then you've got someone like Gwen who is following the spirit and infusing that ministry in the journey, man, the sky is the limit.
Yeah, that's well put. We're in a target-rich environment. I would also follow that by saying we're in perhaps a window which might be finite. And I often will say, people will say, well, you call somebody and you ask them about something, and oh yeah, I'll get to that. Oh, okay, I can, but the window that we're in right now, there's no guarantee that a month from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, some of the resources or some of the data or some of the organizations, federal or otherwise, will even still be in existence. So you kind of have to factor in a lot when you're working on this stuff. I would like to think there should be some healthy urgency to trying to do as much as you can on your leg of the race, because if you just sashay around the track thinking, I got a Carl Lewis that's coming behind me, he'll make up for the slow pace that I set. Carl Lewis may not get a chance to run his leg of the race. It might be all on you. And Dante alluded to Karen and the Descendants of Jesuit Enslavement Historical and Genealogical Society that we're members of, and some of the meetings that we have on Thursdays and other times. But it becomes a collaboration of somebody knows the maps, somebody knows the history, somebody knows the migration, somebody has pieced together some of the DNA. And it's in that melting pot where you're just cooking up the secret sauce and everybody's adding to the collective discovery. And in a group, we're all learning more than we would ever have learned if we stayed separate. So there's power in teaming up with other people and sharing what you have with others and allowing them to share what they have with you. We'll get a lot further if we all just move down this journey together and in a cooperative way.
So true. Kelsey and Gwen, do you have anything that you guys want to say about that blending of the oral history research, DNA testing?
I would say just to make sure that it's done with accuracy and integrity. Just it's so key that somebody else can't tell my story if they really don't know what my family history is. It may look like something to you, and as we join different trees, we need to be respectful, as Jerome and Dante both emphasized, because people are learning and teaching off of that, and individuals like Sam, documenting, as he researched. So the integrity of our information is important, and I would just re-emphasize that. Make sure you know the source and if it is reliable.
The only thing that I would add is, much like Sam alluded to, sometimes with the stories, there's stories that are passed down from family member to family member that become, documented history, where when you do DNA or you do some other research, you find out that that story was developed for protection. And not everyone in the family is ready for the unveiling. You can't just rip the Band-Aid off and allow this, scab to fester. But you have to be able to be and be willing to sometimes be gentle about, providing that information. And it might be in a sense of a spoonful at a time, with a little bit of sugar to let the medicine go down, because it can be a shock to the system because of what's been held as family lore could be completely different, once the true information comes out.
Kelsey, I think that's an amazing point. And actually, I'd like to, some of you, and Sam certainly alluded to this as well, are those times when you're up against family members that don't want to talk about something, or friends that don't want to talk about something, or somebody that there's a connection with who's not there in their journey, or you're, we talked about sitting at the knees of our ancestors, the stories they told, they were kind of covering something up that we didn't want to talk about. So do any of you have any personal stories with that, or any thoughts on that? Because Kelsey, it's an absolutely wonderful point, because people are either at different places in their journey, or I think generationally, there sometimes was not as much of a willingness to talk about certain histories. And I wanted to throw it out for anybody's thoughts or comments on that.
I think Sam said it best when he asked Judge Briscoe about having descendants that don't look like him in the family. And I've worked with my ancestry is a three-legged stool, and I have one side that I've been working with in the community, one arm 20 years and one arm 30 years. And I said, "Hey, how you doing, fam?" I was received well, but I can't get information from them. I can't get information from them. And I understand, because if you look at the time in history, that may not have been a consensual relationship. So I'm not really concerned about what was or wasn't consensual. I just want to learn about my history, but while I'm welcomed, I can't get information. And on the other side, sometimes they want your blood, your DNA, and everything just to accept you into the fold. So 2 of my 3 legs I'm having some extreme challenges with. And it's just part of the journey. And it's hard because you get ready to learn, and then you get the roadblock from your own family. And I have some relatives that are close to me, and they don't want to talk about it. They leave the past in the past. We don't need to go back there. And you have to remember, because of the age, because of the pain, you have no idea what their trauma is. So again, being respectful. While you do want to know more, some things may be left untold.
Yes, that last part. You know, I have had numerous occasions uh, where you know you're talking to somebody and they have a nugget of data that will just break something wide open, but they might not be in the space where they can provide you what you're asking. And I guess everybody's got to do it in their own way. But I've always been of the view that if whatever it is that is keeping them bottled up, I want to give that as much weight as my desire to get the answer, and not give it less weight, because we don't know what's on the other side of that nugget of information and what it might do to them once they reveal it and all that. So it's very hard to know you're close and somebody's got something, but you know, it, they might not be in position to share it. And I'll vent, and if I had hair, I'd pull it out and all that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, I realize that, you know, you're gonna get down the road, but so far, and then you're gonna look around around the edge, and you're gonna see that guy or gal standing there ready to take that baton, and you're gonna hand it off with whatever you've been able to acquire, and now it's their turn to run. So you just do what you can while you can, but you don't want to squabble these windows because they may not be open forever.
Anybody else want to chime in on that one?
Who?
Mhm.
You know, just about, you know, those difficult conversations, you know, having those. And you know, there have been people that I've run into. There was one of our descendants that came on site, and she was telling me the story that she had no idea she was connected to here until she was talking about getting married, and she said something about, you know, she just knew it was pretty over here. So she said, and I could get, we could get married at Sotterley. And the grandmother's like, oh, no, you will not. And it's like, why not? And I'm like, oh, no, why not? You're just not. And it took a while to get around to the why not. And realizing that the family was connected here, had been enslaved here, but that had never come up in the conversation, not till she was thinking about getting married in those pretty gardens. So sometimes things come out when you're least expecting them. That doesn't mean they don't need to be discussed. And as many of you pointed out with children, Kelsey, you said it beautifully. I think the young people today want to know. They're open to hearing it. They're open to you being honest with them. And when the kids here have come for these programs, and I've had the joy of listening to them, the kids will say, you know, people shouldn't have treated each other like that. It was just because of the color of their skin. It wasn't kind. It shouldn't have happened. We need to do better. And they're not looking at it as an indication of who they are today in their own skin, but they're saying, we recognize that as not okay. And we'll accept the reality. But I think generationally, for many that never felt like they could have a voice in society, it was easier to mask, wasn't it? Yeah.
I think along the lines of that too, when we've had the descendant conversations with students, we had a Briscoe descendant and her mother who were chaperones on one of those trips, or the mother was a chaperone and the kid was an 8th grader here. And they were listening to Jan and Gwen talk. And the daughter turns and looks at her mother and said, Did you think I wouldn't figure out that we're connected to these both of them and to this place? I'm not stupid. And the mother was like, we just never talked about it. And it's like kids pick up on a lot more than what you think they do. And they can tell if you are trying to put a wall up where they're trying to put a road up to get information. And so it's the receptiveness is so key and such a big component of this. And the next generation, they are receptive until we teach them to put walls up to block.
Yeah. Well, I could listen to this panel all night. This panel is my family, and I will say, though, my journey did not begin here in Maryland. This is not where my ancestry ties to. The stories that are represented here are my stories. It's our stories. This is our American history. I know back in my ancestry, I know that there were people who enslaved other people. I've just recently found out about them. So for all of us, whether you tie to Sotterley or somewhere else, if you're tied to American history, these stories are your stories, and we all have to be able to look at them together. So I'd like to have a moment to go around to each of you just to give your closing thoughts on this idea of looking in the past to not only with that restorative genealogy, and I'd like to go around to each of you. And so Sam, because you're up in my top corner, I'm going to go with you first. You go for it.
Well, I mean, to me, it's the two words, restorative and genealogy. And genealogy is family relations. And whether it's family relations, how do you define that? And I think the more we do the oral history, the more we do the research, the more, of course, we do the DNA. The definition, the scope of family is a lot broader. One thing I did learn moving down here from Baltimore, one of the first things you learn is everyone is related. That
Yep.
is becoming more true the more we dig. And then, of course, the restorative part. Painful stories, sure. But the more you talk about it, the more you put it in a context, and have these conversations, you can make it a thing of the past, and then just look at everyone on the screen and say, well, we're related. We're somehow or another. And that's what I think. That's what I got out of it once I got that from Judge Briscoe and from Stacy Briscoe and from other clients that I've had over the year. We're all related.
Family. Mr. Jerome, how about you?
Well, in the backdrop that I showed during my earlier comments, my hope was that it would kind of indicate how the present genetically links to the past. And some of the people who were posted who have DNA tested in recent time are connecting in definable ways, going back 2.5 years. So if there's ways where we can, in a science-based manner, show those ancestors and see those ancestors calling out to us via the DNA breadcrumbs that they've dropped for us. All we need to do is answer the call. If anybody has thought about, weighing the pros and cons of trying to allow their DNA to help with this puzzle that many of us are collectively working on, talk to some people, flush out some of the up and down sides of going down that road, and think about some of the folks that maybe are generations under them that might be able to benefit from them contributing to this body of work that many of us have been involved in. And my hope is that more people will, after weighing everything, will decide there's more pluses than minuses with regard to the DNA endeavor, and they'll make that part of how they contribute in going on this journey of discovery.
Thank you so much, Jerome. Miss Gwen, how about you, sweetheart?
On this connected and shared journey of our American history, you have to learn to balance pain with empowerment. And you have to also remember we are a national heritage area. Visit the historic sites to learn about not only your family but other individuals' family. If you're not connected to historic Sotterley, you can still come and touch history. History is alive if you visit these sites. Historic St. Mary City, whether it's in Maryland or somewhere else, visit these sites and start learning about everyone's history, because sooner or later you may stumble across your own history. Uh, Remain open to sharing, write it down, get oral histories, quilt, whatever it is that you need to do in order to capture the legacy that your family has. And I'm also going to encourage descendants to step up into leadership positions, because there's a lot to learn, which I've learned. Yeah, and as you learn, you also learn about your ancestors. You learn the abilities that they have, and you learn what it took to maintain a historic site. Um, Go on the Dove, go on the Pride of Baltimore too. Learn about what experience history. That's my thing. Experience history. Experience history, find your roots, stay connected, remain open, do it truthfully and transparently. And I hope to see you at Historic Sotterley soon.
Mr. Dante, how about you?
I encourage everyone again to share your stories. You are your greatest resource within your family, your community. I also encourage everyone, if you're curious, that old saying, curiosity kills the cat. But if you're curious, take a DNA test, and just know that there will be some knowns, there may be some unknowns, but it's a journey. It is a journey. Um, and one that I take very serious. I often say all the time, I missed my calling. I should be a history teacher or a professor somewhere. But then I began to realize, no, I didn't miss my calling. I'm just operating in my calling in a different way. And I embrace that journey. So I just encourage everyone, uh, don't ever think that you don't have anything to say or there isn't anything to learn. It starts with you. It starts right in your very yard, your space, your community, and reach across, and find you a partner, find you someone to collaborate with. I know my wife probably, she wished I would probably stop talking sometimes, but I find stuff and I just share, because I got to get it out. But in my sharing, I'm connecting dots because of something I saw on a record 10 years ago. But now that record makes more sense today than it did 10 years ago. So there is space for everyone in this journey. So step out, go about it, and there's so much that can be done, and there's so much that we can learn together, and so much we can share for generations to come.
Thank you so much, Dante. Kelsey.
There we go. Everyone's kind of put it succinctly. I look at it as we're building muscle. It's a painful journey at first, but as we go, we shape ourselves into what we want to picture ourselves as. And when we're looking at history in the sense of in the restorative fashion, it is, as Gwen said, a shared history, but it's a painful history. It's one that needs to be talked about in an unblemished, unvarnished fashion in order for us to create a healing environment. We need to step back so that we can step forward. We need to be able to tie ourselves not only to the places and spaces that our roots come from, but the journeys which they spread out amongst, the myriad of different communities. A lot of us might be, from St. Mary's County. As I say, half of me is from St. Mary's County. The other half of me is from Alabama. And trying to figure out how those two stories came tying together to create me, and being able to step and be able to go in a direction to ensure that that story is being shared for generations to come. So I know I'm babbling a little bit.
No, you're not.
But it's one of those where it just, in a way, to touch all of us sometimes will be an uncomfortable but comfortable journey as we move forward together. So that's what I'm trying to say there.
I love that. Trying to make other people as comfortable as possible in their moments of discomfort.
There we go.
There we
You
go.
said it perfectly there, Nancy.
I just took your words. That's wonderful. Catherine, did you have anything you wanted to wrap up and say as well?
In my role here at Sotterley, big part of it, are the tours. And in 10 years of giving tours, I recognize we are all on a journey. We might not be on the same in step with the person next to us on that journey. And I try to tell docents to be mindful of that. But one thing we can do is lead by example. If we present ourselves as open and receptive to a truth which previous generations tried to hide or undermine or diminish, and by showing openness, we can encourage others to be open, to be receptive, to be a vessel to gain more information. And I always look to the relationship between Agnes Kane Callum and John Hanson Briscoe. She had a wealth of knowledge, the research. If you go to the Maryland State Archives, there is not a document up there about the history of slavery in this state that wasn't transcribed by her and touched by her hands. But John Hanson Briscoe had to be receptive to that information that she had, the oral histories, the research, the genealogy, because she was the trifecta in one with that background. By leading by example, but by leading with truth as well. When you come to a place like historic Sotterley, you hear about all the stories, all the people, and you hear about all the history. And we as docents and as interpreters and as this Sotterley staff, we present ourselves as the examples by being open and receptive to other people's journeys, but to also telling and presenting the truth.
Well, I am so grateful to all of you who joined us tonight. I saw so many wonderful comments. So many of our other family members are in the chat. If you're not already a member of the Sotterley family and would like to become a member or volunteer or just reach out to us, we'd love to have you. It has been a joy to start our Sotterley Perspectives this way, our speaker event. We do have another one coming up next month. Do check out our website. In March, we have St. Mary's County History Day. If you're in the county, come out to be inspired on the 8th of March by incredible students who are going to be sharing their projects or their in various forums about history. And Catherine, what is the topic this year for St. Mary's County History Day?
It is the best topic. It is rights and responsibilities in history.
How fabulous is that? So come out and be inspired with us on the 8th, Leonardtown Library. And then we have another speaker event coming up next month and many more to come. But wherever you are in your journey, You are welcome to journey with us anytime. We are so grateful you are here with us tonight. Thank you all. Good night.